Wow, looks amazing. Thanks a lot for the dinner invitation.
We're glad to have you.
Let's try one bean one here. We'll try this. Looks like something I made. We'll take that one.
Oh, there's the lonely cheese.
Take the lonely cheese.
Within reason and conscience, you might want to sprinkle a little more butter on them. It's the culture. What can I say?
Hi, I'm Kix. I love food, travel, and motorbikes. This year, I wanted to see my own backyard, Canada. So I decided to ride the second largest country in the world, coast to coast, on a 250cc dirt bike. It was an incredible opportunity to see the real Canada from inside the kitchens of real Canadians. These are the people and foods that make up this incredible country. Welcome to the Cooked in Canada motorcycle adventure.
In the 1700s, a new type of Christian was evolving in Russia and referred to themselves as God's people. This group of peasant farmers believed in equality, anti-authoritarianism, pacifism, and that the Spirit of God resided in the soul of every person, not just one being, a radical view at the time. By 1786, God's people became known by the derogatory term Doukhobors, aka spirit wrestler, or one who fights against the Holy Spirit. However, they adopted this name and worked it to their advantage, dubbing themselves as those who fought alongside the Holy Spirit and not against him. Clever! The radical beliefs didn't sit well with the Russian Tsar, and the men were forced to fight in the war. After refusing, at midnight on June 29, 1895, 7,000 Doukhobors burned their muskets to protest their conscription in the Russian army. This historical day became known as the Burning of the Arms, the first ever pacifist protest that is still celebrated to this day as Peter's Day. For this defiance, the men were beaten and jailed, though the Tsar was unable to break their beliefs. A deal was eventually made where the group could instead leave the country for good. The Doukhobors' ideals and plight struck a chord with a group of Quakers, as well as the famous Russian writer Leo Tolstoy. With financial backing from both, in 1899, around 7,500 Doukhobors set sail for Canada, in what was the largest migration of a single group at one time in Canadian history. This number wasn't surpassed until over 400,000 immigrants made their way to Canada in 2022, largely made up of Ukrainians, a group who were also under persecution from Russia. It would seem history had repeated itself. Even in Canada, the group's lifestyle came under pressure from the government, and the Doukhobors eventually split into three groups: the independents, who choose to live and farm their homesteads instead of individually, mainly in Saskatchewan; the community Doukhobors, who choose to work and live communally, many have moved to British Columbia; and the Sons of Freedom, or Freedomites, who'd rejected all materialism and earthly authority. This latter group took their beliefs to the extreme and began to protest against material possessions entirely. They demonstrated this by marching the streets naked, burning their clothes and money, and occasionally burning down property and schools. Naturally, this radical group made more headlines than the ones quietly farming the land, and in general, Doukhobors developed an unfavorable reputation in Canada. In reaction to the Freedomites' disdain for government rules and public education, British Columbia RCMP eventually rolled out Operation Snatch. Between 1953 and 1959, close to 200 children from Freedomite families were forcefully taken from their homes and placed in an overcrowded, prison-like New Denver school. Family visits took place every couple of weeks or months depending on what was deemed suitable child behavior, and were often done so through a chain-link fence under police supervision. Unbelievable. These days, as a whole, Doukhobors have transitioned to a typical Canadian lifestyle, and I met up with Doukhobor descendant Jonathan Kalmakoff, whose great-grandparents were on the original boat to Canada in 1899. Jonathan is Canada's foremost Doukhobor researcher and writer of Doukhobor history, and I was lucky enough to land an invitation to his house for a hands-on perah class with him and his daughter Emily.
Okay, Emily, what are we making?
We are making 𝗔𝗓𝐺 or perah.
Perah, yeah.
And where did you learn to make this? Here in the house, or?
Yep, Dad taught me over time.
Yeah.
A traditional Doukhobors dish, perah translates in English to hand pie. According to Jonathan, perah often needs clarification with perah, a misspelling of the same item, and is regularly confused with the Ukrainian pierogi, often of a similar name. The perah is a dough-based delight filled with an array of options that would typically depend on what's being harvested at the time. Today we're cooking up some of John and Emily's favorites: beet, bean, and homemade cottage cheese. John points out there are a variety of options ranging from the savory to the sweet when it comes to perah, like sauerkraut, pureed carrot, pureed pea, garlic mashed potato, or dessert options like sweetened apple, rhubarb, Saskatoon, raspberry, or cranberry. The perah has no limits. Prior to my arrival, they made the dough and prepped the ingredients. Like a well-organized team, Emily would roll out golf ball-sized pieces of dough into football-shaped bases about a half-inch thick. She'd then slide them over to John, where he'd add 2 to 3 tablespoons of either the bean, beet, or homemade cottage cheese mix. They were then pleated by folding over a 2 to 3 centimeter edge onto the opposing side, creating a cute little blanket around the edge of the ingredients. All was going well until John turned over a few of the pies for me to prepare. Now, while John and Emily's looked like perah perfection, mine started to look like lumpy wet blankets whose stuffing had sunk to one end. Emily consoled me by cheerfully stating that on her first try, it was probably worse.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right on.
I feel like you'll know which one is mine by a couple tries. Well,
That is all right.
Our first time making it was
Oh, our first time was,
probably worse. So
it was probably hilarious is what it was.
Sweet kid. They were unaware I had practiced messing up pastries, and I have a long history of ruining family dinners across the globe. Like that one time in Guatemala, where I was chastised by Grandma for blundering the empanadas.
I was in Guatemala one time and I stayed with this family in sort of a little rural village. And I was going to just spend the night, and I'm spending like 4 or 5 days with them.
Yeah.
And so by day 3, they were quite all right with teaching me how to do things and step in. And so she asked me if I wanted to help make empanadas one day.
Ooh,
And I was like, sure, let's do it. I'm happy to help make empanadas. And they make them, and they wrap them in the banana leaf, and they steam them in this huge pot.
Yes.
And 3 or 4 people come and help out. And so I was there helping. And she knew I was not doing a great job, but they were sort of entertaining me. And
Yeah.
they knew that mine would at least hold together. And then I think it was the grandma who showed up maybe about half an hour into this process.
Yeah.
And looked at everyone's, and then she spotted the ones that I'd done and looked at them, and she's like, what? No, this isn't right. And she took them apart and redid them.
no.
Yeah, because she's like, this isn't right. And she wasn't, the lady teaching me was like, it'll be fine. But the lady who had probably taught her, the mother, was like, no, this is not how we're doing this.
That is funny.
I'm like, well, at least we know they'll be done right.
Yeah.
While waiting for them to bake, we got to talking about the history, and I asked John why he'd assembled such an extensive amount of Doukhobors research on his website, doukhobors.org.
I found that I was always a bit of a history geek or a history enthusiast, let's say, even as a kid. And so I would pepper my grandparents. And I should add that I'm probably the last generation that in a traditional way grew up with my, both sets of grandparents and great-grandparents like within a stone's throw of where I grew up.
Wow.
And that was very much, part and parcel of sort of Doukhobors tradition, where they didn't write things down, but they orally transmitted. It's very much an oral culture.
Yeah.
And so, I grew up with all these stories of history, which I might have even been bored and not interested with at the time, but they eventually it kind of caught and took. I grew up on a farm, and we had 2 or 3 ruins of Doukhobors villages from 1899, like within a half mile in any direction. And I would explore them as a kid and think I was Indiana Jones trying to find some lost relic. But suffice to say that there was a lot of inspiration sort of growing up, and I had the benefit of still being surrounded by a lot of the culture. And so, as I reached kind of Emily's age and certainly into university age in my late teens, I read these 2 or 3 general textbooks, and they were really good. They were very inspiring, and they told the overall story. But I kind of left each book thinking to myself, well, that's a great story, but where do I fit in? And so it was kind of this never-ending curiosity in terms of trying to actually just understand the things that my elders took for granted.
He felt compelled to document as much as he could to keep the history alive and not let the culture slip away. What he's been able to compile is an impressive selection of thousands of stories, facts, and photographic documents. Two things that stood out to me were, one, the group's beliefs about things like vegetarianism and not harming animals were so strong that they even refused horsepower to plow the land, and instead strapped themselves to the plows, an image I will never forget. The second was the Sons of Freedom.
Well, so it's important in terms of context to realize that the main body of Doukhobors and 𝗔𝗂𝐴 descendants, even in the 20s, numbered probably about 20,000 in Canada.
Is that right?
And the Sons of Freedom might have numbered several hundred.
Yeah.
But because of their sensational sort of antics, which included and nude protests and burning and bombing down schools, they got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
The problem was in the 40s and 50s and 60s, you have a Canadian press that's basically practicing yellow journalism and tarred everyone with the same brush. Yeah. The Canadian media didn't bother to distinguish between this group of radical several hundred zealots who the main body of Doukhobors basically ostracized and would have nothing to do with, and whose actions were not reflective of the main body of Doukhobors. They tarred them all with the same brush, called them all Doukhobors, and all of a sudden, by the 40s and 50s, you have whole generations of Doukhobor descendants who are blacklisted, from employment, who are embarrassed by their own culture, and it's kind of a real tragedy the way it unfolded. And to this day, if you ask somebody in downtown Toronto or the Maritimes or in Victoria, what do you know about Doukhobors? They're probably going to say, well, they run around naked and they burn down schools.
Yeah.
Jonathan also points out that the Doukhobors were integral to helping build Western Canadian infrastructure. Not so different from the Chinese rail workers, the Doukhobors sought employment building railroads in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They would go off to work for months at a time, come back to their remote homesteads, pool together the money they'd made, and then build up their farms. In a few short years, they went from completely destitute to successful farmers by working hard and working together. There are many examples of how they did this, but their efforts to help expand the rail system is a notable achievement. Soon the warm scent of perah fills the kitchen air. The oven opens and dinner is ready. John then brushes the tops with a bit of butter and lets them cool briefly before we all sit down to enjoy. He apologizes lightly for the multicolored plastic cups of drinking water that are set out, noting he has another younger child who's not here tonight, and plastic is usually safer than glass around this house. I laugh. As a 40-something-year-old who'd rather go for dinner at Chuck E. Cheese than the keg, I'm happy to have the blue plastic cup. As the beet perah hits my lips, I'm surprised to feel the crust is incredibly light and airy. It's an unfair comparison, like comparing, say, sinew to steak. But the consistency reminded me more of those tubes of Pillsbury croissants you just open and bake. Almost unnaturally light and fluffy. A cumulonimbus cloud filled with sweet shredded beet that had magically floated its way into my mouth. Obviously, the taste was nothing like Pillsbury anything, but that crust was unbelievable. I'm unaware of a Doukhobor-themed store anywhere in North America. The only way to have come across this dish would be to know a descendant who's still practicing the food traditions and wind up at their table for a meal. If there are 40 million people in Canada and 30,000 of them are Doukhobor descendants, and even a third of those are following just a tiny bit of the tradition, and I happen to meet one of them, who also happens to be the country's foremost documentary research of Doukhobor history, the odds of landing on this experience are rarer than getting your hands on a slice of traditional French sailor's cheese. Unbelievable. And I'm grateful for every bite. If you want to learn more about the Doukhobors, I suggest checking out Jonathan's website, doukhobor.org. Hey, if you're enjoying the show, take a second to hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Your support helps us share these incredible stories with even more awesome people like you. Thanks for watching. Next time on the Cooked in Canada motorcycle adventure, we completely break the rules on in-home dining experiences and find ourselves at a Canadian institution with deep Italian roots. to learn about the Godfather's panini.